Hi everyone and welcome to the Optimapharm podcast. I'm your host Stephanie Garey and today I'm speaking with one of our amazing strategic advisors, Jeff Trotter, who's here to help us dig into our latest white paper, Observational Research, the need for a customized operational approach, aligning strategy, design and execution for real world evidence. So welcome Jeff, how are you today? Tell us a bit more about your role in this white paper, please.
Well, thanks, Steph. I'm good. The white paper was co-authored by colleagues Sylvia and Carol at the project management group at Optimapharm, but it was very much driven by a lot that's going on in this industry for observational research, non-interventional research, kind of everything under the umbrella of real-world research. The real world is extremely important, as we'll get into, I think, in our discussion. So excited about having that white paper available for distribution.
Yeah, me too. I'm sure it's been a long time in the making. But Jeff, it'd be really exciting to hear a little bit more about your role. You're a strategic advisor. I hear one of the best at Optimapharm. What does that mean and what does your day-to-day look like?
Well, my day-to-day is always a little bit interesting. So I've been involved in this field of under the umbrella of real-world research for, it seems like 100 years or so. I've been involved in serving various pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, for probably the last 40 years or so. I started out my career more on the provider side, working with hospitals and managed care organizations in the U.S., but evolved very quickly over to working with pharmaceutical and biotech companies when the issue of the cost efficiency or cost effectiveness of medicine became quite important here in the U.S. An important reimbursement change really motivated providers to start thinking about the cost effectiveness of medical technologies. The price tag is always very obvious. It's the tip of the iceberg, if you will, but underneath the surface lies some really important issues that impact upon the overall cost of caring for a patient. I wrote a very brief book a while back called The Quest for Cost Effectiveness in Healthcare, Optimizing Clinical Outcomes and Achieving Cost Control at the same time. So these are important issues that have been around for a while. And now the industry, really fast forward to today, is really focused in quite a bit on what happens in the real world. And we can talk a little bit about how the real world differs from perhaps more of the experimental world that randomized clinical trials are all about. But again, fundamentally, it's an important capability that Optimapharm has in supporting the needs of pharmaceutical companies in generating and accessing real world evidence, real world data. My role is to kind of provide whatever perspective I've picked up, the one or two things I've learned over the last 40 years or so, providing some strategic oversight as well as some occasionally useful operational perspectives as well.
Yeah, amazing. Well, you're the right person for the job for this conversation then. Thank you so much, Jeff. Now, let's get back to that white paper. And this is a pretty tough question, but I feel like if anyone can answer it, Jeff, it's you. So do you reckon you can summarize the white paper in kind of 60 seconds or less, please?
Oh, that's a good test. Well, I'd say it has two primary objectives. One is to really reaffirm and acknowledge the importance of this whole concept of real world evidence, the importance of documenting the clinical value, the economic value, the humanistic value from a patient perspective of medical technologies and drugs and medical devices in more of a real world setting. And we can talk a little bit more about what I mean by real world. So that's really number one, in ensuring that we are acknowledging why the real world is real important. And then in view of the nuances of undertaking research in that kind of environment, we then focus in on some of the operational issues, how to actually undertake research in a very customized, kind of fly on the wall manner such that we're not impacting what we're really looking to observe. And so those are the kind of the two primary things, why, a little bit of the why and the how.
Perfect. Nicely done. I didn't quite keep count, but I would say that was
I think it's well under 60
Perfectly
seconds.
done, Jeff. Yeah. Amazing. And so I guess you've mentioned it a couple of times, but best to start then by summarizing the importance of the real world evidence. Would you mind telling us a bit more about that, please?
Sure. Well, let me define a little bit about what I mean by real world. The real world is obviously where patient care happens, and it's really interesting that regulatory authorities examine drugs in more of a controlled, perfect environment and then the drugs are used under situations that are quite different from those controlled environments. So the real world is kind of like the actual traffic conditions you might see on the New Jersey Turnpike or on the Autobahn or in the M5. And whereas drugs are tested under more pristine controlled conditions, like the automotive test track, if you will, where you've got no other drivers, where it never rains and never snows, you've got perfect controls over how the automobile is tested, and so you really understand fuel efficiency under those perfect conditions. But then the real world happens. You're driving, you've got my kids next to you, you're swerving all over the place, and your fuel efficiency is going to really change. Your mileage may vary is really what happens in the real world. So if we look at drugs versus automobiles, drugs are tested under very pristine, controlled conditions, perfect patients that don't have any other comorbidities that are exactly who we want to determine whether the drug works or not. But then in the real world, patients have comorbidities. Patients have other illnesses. Patients may not be perfectly adherent to a drug regimen. There may be all sorts of variables in as far as how physicians vary and how they manage these patients that really need to be looked at. So the real world performance of a product is something that the pharmaceutical and the biotech industry is very concerned about because their stakeholders, physicians, patients, reimbursement authorities, and regulators are increasingly interested in how a drug performs under those real world conditions. So as I say, the real world is real important. It's real messy at the same time, which has some important operational implications as we try to undertake research under those crazy Wild West conditions.
Yeah, totally. And I guess, do you think it's a bit of a mix of like the science and the strategy around getting those elements right?
Well, that's a good way to characterize it because it's not quite that black and white, but the science of drug development is really important, and I'm not casting any dispersions over how drugs are examined for regulatory approval. There's the gold standard of the randomized clinical trial that is very scientific, very supportive of appropriate evidence, and I wouldn't want to change any of that. But the reality is that the drugs are used under different conditions, and so really they complement each other. The science of randomized clinical trials are complemented by more of the strategic implications for real world evidence. And again, it's not that black and white because while a company may not be required to do real world research, the reality is it's almost a de facto requirement for strategic commercial success. And so, again, we don't want to compromise science in doing these studies, but we may have to make some adjustments for, again, the messiness of the real world in doing those projects.
Of course. It's a good life lesson all round, I think. Thanks, Jeff. So I'm really interested to know then how the studies are actually completed. And I guess in the context of all of this, what's the appropriate approach you would think for generating that real world evidence, please?
Yeah, so that's again, I don't know that we have time to. We probably this is not only going to be just 60 seconds, it may be 60 minutes, but I'll minimize this. Bottom line is the real world is again is real messy, and ideally we just want to observe what happens in the real world, because if we try to construct too much of an experiment, well, we're changing what we're trying to observe in the first place. So we have to be very non-interventional, very observational in our approach. We have to, again, as I mentioned earlier, be somewhat of a fly on the wall in examining what happens. And that has important implications in the design, the implementation, the execution, the analyses of data from these studies. But fundamentally, the main difference between pre-approval clinical trials for regulatory approval and perhaps more post-approval studies understanding how the product works in the real world is kind of interventional research versus observational or non-interventional research. And again, observing what's happening in the real world has some important implications for the level of definitiveness of the results. Because the real world is real messy, we may not be able to establish the kind of hypothesis needed to really determine if A is better than B in the real world. It's a lot more difficult to control for those factors in the real world without, again, changing the real world. So from data sources to how data are acquired to how the experiment is done to how the data are analyzed, statistical issues, you name it. Everything is a little bit different in the real world studies. But again, the fundamental difference is typically an interventional experiment versus an observational study. And I'm using these words carefully because, for example, the connotation of an observational trial, in my mind, that's a contradiction in terms. Trial has a very important connotation as more of an experimental program versus an observational study or research initiative. Observational trial, in my mind, is a bit of a contradiction in terms. So we don't use the word subject, for example, in talking about the patients that participate in a real world study, because again, they're not subjects of an experiment as much as they are actual patients, and we're just trying to observe what happens, how treatments are managed, and what their outcomes are in as much of a non-interventional manner as possible. And it's not, again, it's not always easy to do, but it's important to understand those operational differences and the implications.
Yeah, totally. No, thank you for explaining that. Presumably, I would imagine a lot of this can't be done in-house. So, Jeff, what do biotech and pharma have to consider when they're outsourcing?
That's a good question because, again, there may be some pharma companies that have some in-house staff that are really focused in on the traditional randomized clinical trials for approval. The real-world studies are a little bit different, and it may not really merit the kind of investment required for bringing somebody in-house. So typically, we're looking at using a contract research organization, a CRO, a clinical research organization, to provide that support. And again, the issue there, and I've worked with a few different CROs over the last 100 years or so. Some of them really are very, very comfortable with traditional clinical trials. Most CROs truly are. That's their meat and potatoes. But the randomized clinical trial really requires more of an 18-wheel truck approach. It's carrying a heavy load, and you've got to have drivers that really understand how to drive that big vehicle, versus a real world study that requires a lot more flexibility, a lot more pivoting, and it's maybe analogous to a sports car on a racetrack. And so you wouldn't want to have a truck driver drive that sports car, and vice versa. You wouldn't want to have the sports car driver driving the big truck. So different approaches, different tools, different resources. Most of the CROs recognize that we need to do this a little bit differently. Many of them have committed different people really focused on that particular issue. Optimapharm, again, is a good example of an organization that's established a really strong capability and has kind of ring-fenced that capability so that it's not inadvertently just a lighter version of a traditional clinical trial. There are so many nuances in undertaking clinical research in a controlled manner that we really don't want to impose upon these kind of real world studies, because again, it would be over engineering, it would change the experiment, it would impose controls over the real world, which would change fundamentally what the real world's all about. So again, outsourcing one of these studies, we need to look for a partner that really understands the differences and is not just using over engineering, using approaches that are appropriate for randomized clinical trials and kind of quote unquote dumbing them down for a real world study. That's unfortunately, I've seen that too many times. That's not an approach that Optimapharm takes.
Amazing. Well, let's talk about the people side for a bit then. Observational research relies a lot on those real clinics and the real data. So, Jeff, how do you think sponsors are able to support sites better and ensure data quality without actually overburdening them?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because at the end of the day, who is the evidence directed towards? Well, ultimately, it's the physicians, the patients that are, and patients obviously are of critical importance, involved in medical care, involved in the real world provision of medicine. And so these are important studies to be done. And again, there are clinical trialists who get up in the morning and get very excited about doing these experimental studies. And then there are practitioners that get up in the morning and get excited about seeing patients. That's really the real world that we're working with. And so we want to be as operationally efficient. We want to be as sensitive to not interfering with patient care. But at the same time, we're really looking for useful information to glean from doing these reasonably structured studies. So in many ways, the best way to do it is to acknowledge that, hey, again, we're really serious about the data, but we're serious about not impacting upon your interactions with patient care or anything you would do on a day-to-day basis, because again, we want to be as much a fly on the wall as possible. So In many cases, CROs are embracing different technological imperatives, grabbing data wherever it may lie so that it doesn't have to be entered into a system, which again is not something anybody ever gets up in the morning gets excited about. So, technological innovations, for example, like grabbing electronic medical record data as a way to pre-populate some of the fields that are very important for undertaking these studies, is not only more cost efficient, but it's also very sensitive to the participants in these programs to make sure that I'll never say that participating in study is fun, but it shouldn't be a burden. And so being very conscious of minimizing the burden of the sites, minimizing the burden of the patients. That said, observational research is always a little bit, well, I'll use the word observational. It's not purely observational because there's a study going on. So when patients have to, for example, fill out a quality of life questionnaire, that's just something that's not done in routine medical care. So it's a little bit of an intervention that again we impose on a study, and hopefully we're not changing how the physician would prescribe a particular product or how the patient will react to the product just by giving them the opportunity to emote on a quality of life questionnaire. But again, that is a little bit different from the real world. But again, to the extent we can make it as easy and as useful and as burdenless for the patient as possible, whether they can fill it out on their smartphone or on their computer rather than imposing pen and pencil on them, is probably the way to do it to ensure that, again, we're not interfering with the real world as much as possible. So recognizing again that ultimately these findings are going to be useful for improving the lives of patients, improving the role of improving the physician's ability to understand the role of a particular product in the real world, ensuring that reimbursement authorities understand the true value of a product. These are the people that are participating in the study, so we have to ensure that it's as easy on them as possible, while at the same time being very serious about the data we're collecting. It's as much an art as it is a science, I'd say.
Yeah, totally. Amazing. Oh, well, thank you so much, Jeff, for that brilliant insight into the white paper. And of course, if anybody listening wants to read the full thing and get all of the insights, head to the episode description and you'll find the link to download it there. And of course, all of us here at the Optimapharm team would love to keep the conversation going. So if you've got any questions, do reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. But from me and Jeff, that's it. Jeff, thank you so much today.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you next time. Goodbye.